While I was planning a life with Suda in the village she grew up in, her ex-boyfriend was sitting in the house I was paying for, eating food I was buying, sleeping in a bed I had shipped from Bangkok. The whole village knew, her mother knew, the monks at the temple knew, the woman at the noodle stall knew, everyone knew except me, and I think looking back that was precisely the point. My name is Nigel Armstrong. I'm 69 years old, retired. Born in Wolverhampton, spent 28 years working in industrial equipment sales, the last 12 of which I was very good at it. I say that not to brag, but because it matters to this story. I was good at reading people. I was good at knowing when someone was telling me what I wanted to hear versus what was true. I built a career on that skill. I mention this because the question I keep coming back to is not why she cheated. I've made my peace with that. The question that haunts me is how a man who built his professional life on human perception could have been so completely, catastrophically wrong. I came to Thailand in 2019. Voluntary retirement at 64, decent pension. House in Wolverhampton sold after the divorce from my first wife 17 years prior. I had money. I had time. I had the reasonable confidence of a man who has navigated the world successfully and emerged more or less intact. I'd been to Thailand twice before on holidays, the second time lingering for 3 months. I liked the climate. I liked the food. I liked the pace of life. I told myself I was moving there for quality of life, which was true. I told myself I wasn't lonely, which was, in retrospect, the first of many lies I told myself during this period. I met Suda through a mutual contact, a Thai woman who worked in a restaurant I frequented in Udon Thani. She was not a bar girl. I want to make that clear because the narrative arc of these stories often runs through Nana Plaza or Walking Street, and mine doesn't. Suda was working at a mobile phone repair shop near the night market. 33 years old, from a village about 40 kilometers outside of Udon. She spoke reasonable English, better than she let on, I think, better than she showed me in those early months. She was intelligent, watchful, and had a kind of quiet composure that I mistook for depth. She was also, without question, one of the most attractive women I had ever spent time with. I was 65 at the time. She was 31. I'm not going to pretend the age gap didn't factor into my judgment, because that would be another lie. But I told myself, and I told my friends back home who raised eyebrows, that it was different, that we had a genuine connection, that I wasn't one of those men. That phrase, not one of those men. I should have a plaque made with that phrase and hang it over my bed as a warning, because the moment a man says that in Thailand, about himself, with any kind of conviction, the universe should have a mechanism that taps him on the shoulder and says, "Sit down, mate. You're precisely one of those men." The first year with Suda was, I'll say it plainly, wonderful. She was warm without being cloying. She was interested in my life, asked questions about England, about my work, about my kids, 2 grown adults who lived in Bristol and called occasionally. She came to stay with me in Udon after about 3 months, and within 6 months she had moved in. I was paying for the apartment, which was understood. I also started sending money to her family in the village each month, which she asked for carefully, diplomatically, not as a demand but as a request that made me feel useful and generous and needed, which I was. I was all 3 of those things, and I enjoyed being them. That enjoyment was the engine of everything that came after. We visited her village for the first time in January 2020, a cluster of houses near a rice field, about 200 people if you were generous with the count. Her mother was a small, wiry woman in her mid-50s who smiled at everything and seemed genuinely pleased to have me there. Her father had passed years earlier. She had a younger brother, Lek, who was 26, wiry and quiet, who nodded at me and not much more. The community was friendly in the way that rural Thai communities are friendly toward the foreign boyfriend of a local woman. Polite, curious, with just enough warmth to be encouraging and just enough reserve to be unreadable. I noticed a man at the edge of a gathering on my second evening there. Tall for a Thai man, lean, wearing a dark shirt. Someone told me his name was Arthit, a local farmer. Suda introduced him briefly, said they had grown up together, and moved on. I registered him the way you register most things that don't immediately threaten you. filed and forgotten. That was the thing about my arrogance, and I want to be precise about it, because arrogance gets described as a surface quality, vanity, bluster, the inability to listen. Mine was quieter than that. Mine was a bone-deep certainty that my judgment was reliable, that I had earned, through experience and intelligence and the accumulated wisdom of a long life, the right to read a situation correctly. When I looked at Suda and felt that she was genuine, that feeling carried the full weight of my self-confidence behind it. I wasn't an idiot who ignored red flags out of naivety. I was a confident man who evaluated the flags and decided they were not red. That's a more dangerous kind of wrong. We went to the village perhaps 4 or 5 times that first year. Each time I saw Arthit at a distance, once or twice closer, at community meals, during a temple festival. He was always there in the way that certain people in small villages are always there, present at the periphery of everything, rooted in a place the way trees are rooted. I noted that he never seemed to have a girlfriend of his own, and Suda, when I asked once, said only that he was shy, that he'd had a hard time after his family's land sale fell through. I remember thinking briefly that it was interesting she knew the details of his financial situation. Then I stopped thinking about it, because I was good at reading people, and I had read this situation, and it was fine. The cracks began in late 2021, not explosively, quietly, the way damp gets into old walls. You don't notice the damage until the plaster starts to buckle. Suda began visiting her village more frequently. Once a month had been the pattern. It became twice a month, then sometimes 3 weekends in a row. I didn't raise it immediately. Her mother's health was declining, she said, and there was work to be done on the family land. And I was sympathetic because I had met her mother, and she did seem older than her years, and because being sympathetic made me feel like a good partner rather than a suspicious one. I told myself the frequency of her visits was proportional to maternal need. I had decided it was fine, and so I allowed every subsequent piece of information to be sorted into that prior conclusion. But there were other things. She started putting her phone face down on tables, which she hadn't done before. I noticed it in the way you notice a small change in furniture arrangement, vaguely, without urgency, storing it as a low-priority observation. Her line notifications used to ping freely, visible when the screen lit up. By the start of 2022, they were silent, screen dark. She said she'd turned off notifications because they were distracting while she was working, and she said it easily, without defensiveness, which I took as evidence that it was true, as if the ease of a lie had any relationship to its validity. The name Arthit appeared once in a conversation about the village that February. She mentioned that he had helped her brother repair a section of roof, which was good of him, practical, neighborly. She said it in passing. I received it in passing. But somewhere in the part of my brain that was already, without my permission, beginning to compile a file, it was noted. I can pinpoint the moment the file began to demand my attention. It was a Wednesday in March of 2022. Suda had gone to the village that weekend and come back Monday, as planned, but she came back different. Not dramatically, subtly. She was distracted in a way she'd never been before, answering questions half a beat late, sitting with her phone in her lap during dinner. She laughed at a message at one point and then looked up and caught my eyes, and the laugh stopped, folded back into a neutral expression. It was the speed of that folding that registered. Laughter doesn't stop like a switch. Hers did. I said nothing that night. But I went to sleep with something sitting on my chest that I couldn't name, and I woke up with it still there, and I started paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. Over the following 6 weeks, the observations accumulated. She began showering immediately upon returning from the village, which she hadn't previously done. She started buying new clothes, nothing extravagant, but the choices were different, younger somehow, more considered than the practical, comfortable style she'd had before. Once, coming to bed after she'd fallen asleep, I picked up her phone to move it from the pillow and felt its weight and thought about looking at it and put it down and lay there in the dark and felt genuinely afraid for the first time. Not afraid of what I'd find. Afraid of what it would mean to look, because looking would mean I had stopped trusting her, and if I stopped trusting her, it meant my judgment had been wrong for 3 years. and I was not, at that point in my life, ready to be that wrong. I asked her once, in April, casually, who she'd been messaging. We were having dinner at the apartment. She said it was a work friend, a woman she'd met at a training session. She said the woman's name, and I received the name and filed it, and 2 days later, when I tried to remember it, I couldn't, because I think some part of me knew it hadn't been real, that it had been a placeholder name dropped into the conversation to fill a gap, and real names of real people tend to stick differently than invented ones. The crisis point for my denial arrived in May 2022, at a dinner with 2 other British expats I knew from Udon, Gerald and his Thai wife Nong. We'd had a few beers. Nong had had a few more. Gerald had gone to the bathroom. Nong looked at me across the table with an expression I can only describe as deliberate and said, "Nigel, Suda is good girl mostly, but you know about Village, yes? You know the situation?" I asked her what situation. Gerald came back. Nong laughed at something and moved on and never said it again. I asked her directly the following week, by message, what she'd meant. She replied that she'd been drinking, that she didn't mean anything, that I shouldn't worry. I told myself it was drunken vagueness and nothing more. But I want to be honest about what happened inside me after that dinner. Something shifted, not the collapse of belief, not yet, but a fissure, a crack in the wall I'd built around my certainty. I started driving past the apartment to see if there were lights on before I came home. I started noting the precise time she messaged me when she was in the village. Once, when she'd left her phone to charge on the kitchen counter, I walked past it 3 times without looking at it and then left the room because I knew that if I stood there a 4th time I would look, and I wasn't ready for what that action meant about me. The phone got a password in June. She said she'd done it because she'd lost a phone 2 years before and hadn't been in the habit, and now she was being more careful. She said it while making tea, without looking at me, and I said that made sense, and I think we both knew, in that moment, that we were 2 people performing a conversation rather than having one. I went to the village unannounced in early July. I hadn't planned it. I'd said I was too tired to make the drive that weekend, that she should go without me and I'd rest. Then, on Saturday morning, something I can't explain made me get in the car. My left eye had been twitching for a week, just constant, low-grade twitching that the pharmacist said was stress. No kidding. I drove the 40 kilometers with my eye twitching and my hands on the wheel and my chest doing that thing it had been doing since March. I parked on the road before the village entrance, walked in. Her mother's house was at the far end of a short lane. I came around the corner, and there was a motorcycle I didn't recognize parked outside. The door was open. I could hear voices from inside. I stood in the lane, and I felt my hands go cold, which is strange because it was 34 degrees, but the blood went out of them like a tide pulling back. I walked to the doorway. Arthit was sitting at the table, not in a compromising position, just sitting, eating, a plate of rice and a glass of water in front of him, Suda opposite him, and her mother at the stove. It was completely ordinary. It was a man having lunch in a home. And all 3 of them looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and the look on Suda's face was not one of guilt, not immediately, not obviously. It was something more complex than guilt. It was a look of reckoning, of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment to arrive and is now watching it walk through the door in a linen shirt and sunglasses. Her mother's face was something else entirely. Her mother smiled. The smile of a woman who has been holding a secret in a small container for a very long time and is quietly, privately, relieved to have it taken from her. I said hello. My voice was very even. I'd been in enough difficult negotiations in my working life to know how to keep a voice level when things inside are doing the opposite of level. Arthit looked at me, and then at Suda, and then at his plate. Suda stood up. She said something in Thai to her mother. Her mother went to a back room. Suda looked at me and said, "Nigel, let me explain. Here is what I had expected. I had expected her to tell me Arthit was here doing something practical, fixing something, that his motorcycle had broken down, that her brother had asked him to help with something. I had expected an explanation that would be plausible enough that I could choose to accept it because I had been choosing to accept things for months and I was very practiced at it. She didn't give me one. She sat back down. She looked at the table. She said, "He is not just a friend." She said it quietly, in English, which I think was deliberate, which I think was, for me, so that there was no ambiguity in translation. He is not just a friend, was not a full confession. But it was the end of the version of this relationship that had existed until that moment, and she knew it, and I think she had known it would end this way for a while, which explained the look when I walked in. Not guilt, recognition. I asked her how long. She didn't answer immediately. I asked her again, and my voice was still level, which surprised me, which surprises me still. She said it had been complicated. I told her I wasn't asking for a characterization, I was asking for a duration. She looked up at me. She said they had never really fully stopped. Those 5 words rearranged something structural in my understanding of the previous 4 years. Never really fully stopped. Which meant what I had understood to be a past relationship was, in actual practice, a parallel one. Which meant the entire architecture of what I had believed to be our relationship had been built on a foundation that included him. He had been there from the beginning, not as a memory or a closed chapter, but as a continuing fact. I was the addition to their story. They were not additions to mine. I walked outside. I stood in the lane in the heat, and I looked at the rice fields, and I thought about all the weekends she had been here, all the money I had sent every month, all the improvements to the house that had been made in the past 4 years, the repaired roof, the new kitchen tiles I had paid for, the water tank, and Arthit, who I now understood had been present for all of it, eating at that table, sleeping, I had to assume, in that house on some of those nights, embedded in a domestic life that I had been funding and occasionally visiting as a guest without knowing that was what I was. Her mother came to the doorway and looked at me. She said something in Thai. Her expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a woman who has seen this before and knows there is no clean version of what comes next. I went back inside. Suda was still at the table. Arthit had gone. I didn't know when. The motorcycle was gone when I came back in. I sat down opposite her. I asked her to tell me the whole truth. Not selected portions. Everything. What came out over the next 40 minutes was a process of excavation rather than confession. She spoke carefully, releasing information in increments, testing how each piece landed before continuing. They had been together since their early 20s, she said. He was the man her family had expected her to marry. But he had no money and no prospects, and she had made a different choice, the choice many young women in her situation make, and had moved to Udon and eventually met me. She had ended things with him, she said. For a time. But he was there when she came home. He was part of that world in a way that could not be surgically removed. The village was 30 families. He farmed adjacent land. He ate at her mother's table 3 times a week. Ending things, in the abstract, had not translated to separation in the practical reality of that village. I asked if she loved him. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "I love different things different ways." I understood what that meant. I also understood that nothing that followed from it could salvage what we had, because what we had been constructed on my belief that I was in a particular kind of relationship, and it turned out I had been in a different kind entirely, one with an additional participant and an entirely different logic. I asked if she had intended to maintain this indefinitely. She said she didn't know. I believed her. That was perhaps the most truthful thing she said. She had not been running a conscious long-term scheme. She had been living in the space between 2 worlds and had not made a decision about which one she was actually in, and the decision had been made for her by my unannounced arrival on a Saturday in July. I drove back to Udon that afternoon. I did not pack her things. I did not issue ultimatums. I did not do the dramatic version of any of this. I drove back and I sat in the apartment for 2 days and I thought. What I thought about, mostly, was not her. It was me. It was the specific, detailed texture of my own willful blindness. Gnawing at the dinner table, saying, "You know the situation." The first time I met Arthit, the particular quality of how the village registered him in relation to Suda, which I had perceived and dismissed. The phone turning face down. The password. Her mother's smile when I walked through the door. That particular smile, which I understood now had been relief. The relief of a woman who had been watching a situation approach its inevitable conclusion and was glad it was finally here. I had known, not consciously, not in the part of my brain that processed information and made confident assessments, but in another part, quieter and less triumphant. I had known since March at the latest, probably longer, and I had deployed the full force of my self-confidence in the project of not knowing, because the alternative to not knowing was the admission that I had been badly, fundamentally wrong, and I was 68 years old and had been successfully confident my whole life, and I was not willing to pay that price. That, in the end, was my real failure. Not trusting too much, protecting my own certainty at the expense of my own eyes. Suda came back to the apartment 3 days later. We had one more conversation, shorter than the first, without the heat of recent discovery. She said she was sorry. She said it like someone who meant it, and also understood that meaning it accomplished nothing. I told her I needed her to be out of the apartment by the following weekend. She nodded. She left that evening and came back twice for her things, both times when I was not there, which I had asked her to do and she had respected. The last item she left behind was a small Buddha figurine she had placed on the kitchen windowsill when she moved in. I don't know if she left it deliberately or forgot it. I didn't message her to ask. In the weeks after that, I did what I imagine most people do after a discovery like this. I rebuilt the timeline obsessively, in the dark, at 3 a.m, retroactively annotating 4 years of memory with what I now knew. That first village visit, January 2020, Arthit at the edge of the gathering. The quality of how he watched her, which I had registered and not examined. The way she moved around the space of her mother's house with a comfort that included him, not around him. That weekend in October 2021, when she came back and was quieter than usual, and I had attributed it to tiredness. The new dress I had bought her the previous Christmas that she had worn, she said, to her cousin's birthday in the village. I thought about what else she might have worn it to. I thought about this a great deal, and then decided to stop, because some calculations only produce numbers you can't use. Gerald told me later, carefully, that Nong had known more than she'd said that night, that it had been common knowledge in a small community of expats in Udon that Suda's situation was what it was, that the village boyfriend arrangement was not a secret to anyone who cared to ask the right people. Gerald had not told me because Gerald valued our friendship and had hoped he was wrong, and because telling a man something like that is one of the more unpleasant things you can do to him. I told him I didn't blame him. I mostly meant it. I'm still in Thailand. Different city now, a small town in Chiang Rai province that I chose partly because it was as far from Udon as I could reasonably get while staying in the country I'd made my home. I haven't started a new relationship. I don't have plans to. Whether that changes, I genuinely don't know, and I've made my peace with not knowing. What I know now, that I didn't know then, is this. The first thing is about confidence. Confidence in your own judgment is a useful tool in most contexts. In this context, it was a weapon I handed to someone else to use against me. Every time she said something that didn't quite add up, and I decided, from a position of confident authority, that it was fine, I was doing her work for her. My certainty made her job easy. She didn't need to be a skilled deceiver. She just needed to present something plausible enough for my ego to do the rest. The second thing is about the village. I had understood intellectually that rural Thai social structures are complex, that relationships between people who grew up together in small communities don't end the way urban relationships end, that geography and family and shared history create ties that can't be cleanly severed just because someone has decided, strategically, to sever them. I understood this the way you understand things that don't yet apply to you. I did not understand it in the way that would have made me ask different questions, pay different attention, recognize that the man at the edge of every gathering was not peripheral to her life. He was its center. I was the addition. The third thing is about what the village owed me. Nothing. That's the hard answer, and I think it's the true one. Those 30 families had known Suda since she was born. They had known Arthit since he was born. They had watched a situation develop over a long time, and a foreign man had arrived with money and certainty and had been welcomed with the hospitality that Thai villages extend to strangers, and they had made a collective decision, consciously or otherwise, to protect what was theirs from what had arrived from the outside. I was, to them, an institution rather than a person, a resource. Something that had happened to their community from outside. They owed me honesty, the way passing strangers owe each other honesty. Technically, in principle, but not with any great urgency. Whether that's ethical is a question I've turned over 100 times. I don't think it has a clean answer. The fourth thing is about what I owe myself, which is the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Especially then. My gut knew something from March 2022 and probably earlier. And I sat on that knowledge and smothered it because admitting uncertainty about something I'd already confidently decided felt like a loss. It was not a loss. It would have been a saving. If I'd listened to that eye-twitching, chest-heavy, 3 a.m. self instead of the board meeting, sales career, I know what I know self, I'd have had different conversations in 2022 and a different outcome. Not necessarily a better relationship, but a shorter lie. That would have been worth something. The fifth thing is this, and I'm directing it at you, specifically if you're reading this in a situation that resembles the one I've described. If you are visiting her village and there is a man there who is always present but never explained, who exists in her mother's kitchen with the ease of someone who belongs there, who she introduces briefly and moves quickly past, do not file that observation in the low priority drawer. That man is not peripheral. Ask the question. Ask it directly, not diplomatically, not with the comfortable confidence of someone who expects a reassuring answer. Ask it like someone who needs an honest one. If she is going home to a village more often than the stated reason requires, and the stated reason is always slightly vague, a combination of family and duty and practicality that is impossible to argue with, note the vagueness. Note that genuine explanations tend to have specifics and constructed ones tend to have categories. If other people, expats, locals, friends, are giving you looks across dinner tables and saying things that don't quite finish them. Ask them what they mean. A friend who is hesitating to tell you something difficult is a friend who is trying to protect a relationship more than they're trying to protect you. Don't let them. Push. And if your own gut is conducting a separate investigation from your conscious mind, if some part of you is noting timestamps and measuring distances between what she says and what the evidence suggests, do not put that part to sleep. It is doing a job your ego is preventing. Let it do the job. I was good at reading people. I still believe that. What I was not good at was applying that skill to a situation where being wrong had too high a cost for my self-image. That was the loophole she lived in for 4 years. Not her manipulation, though there was that, my loophole. The gap between what I saw and what I was willing to conclude. The village knew. Everyone knew. That fact has a kind of terrible completeness to it. A little Buddha figurine still sits on the kitchen windowsill in the apartment in Udon. Someone else's kitchen, now. Someone else's life. Whether any of it was real is a question I stopped asking about 6 months ago, not because I found an answer, but because I realized the answer doesn't change anything that happened, and I have less time left than I've already used, and I'd prefer to spend it in the present tense. If you think she's different, that she's genuine, that you can feel it, maybe you're right, maybe you can. But if you're relying on the confidence of that feeling to do the work that evidence should do, you're not reading the situation. You're choosing an outcome and filtering everything through it. I know what that looks like from the inside. It looks like certainty. It looks, from the outside, like something else entirely.